I've been researching history, and particularly the history of local government in the Fingal area for the last 10 years. I completed my master's on that topic, covering a period from 1891 to 1914. The appeal for me was that was after the death of Parnell, but yet before the First World War. And when I was in school, we were always told, and then Parnell died and the Home Rule Party split. And the next thing that happened was the Ulster Crisis and the lockout and the First World War. And it was a period in which we were kind of brought up to believe nothing ever happened. But it's those periods between convulsions, between revolutions, between rebellions, that actually are the periods of progress, the periods of consolidation, the periods when we're looking at ordinary life and ordinary people doing things. And the history of local government is the history of people, because in independent Ireland, people's connection with government was their connection with local government. And it's a history through the ages, really, because that's where everything happens in relation to housing, sewage, water, drainage, the beginnings of a healthcare system, the beginnings of welfare systems, the beginnings of sanitation. So we see all of that, including education as well. And even though Catherine said we're kind of starting because of the way the funding was and because of what was required with number 4, if number 4 in the series of 6 was good enough for George Lucas and Star Wars, it's good enough for me and it's good enough for Fingal. So we're going to cover, or I'm going to research right back to, so the next book I'm working on at the moment is the 1940s, 50s and 60s, and then up to the end of Dublin County Council in 1993 and the beginning of the of Fingal County Council. And then I'm going to go back and look at the grand juries from the time of the Act of Union up to 1838, and from 1838 to 1898 look at the poor law boards of guardians, and then look again at the revolutionary period, from which is really the heyday of Fingal politicians in Dublin County Council from 1899 up until the end of the Civil War in 1923. So there will be a book a year for the next 5 years, and they will all be free. So I believe passionately and strongly that if I'm doing this research, it shouldn't just go into a book that's going to cost 80 or 90 euros and you'll only get it in a university library. The history of local government and this social history of North County Dublin is for everybody. And because of the generous funding of both the department and the council, it can be shared with everybody. So the book is free through the library system. Now, within my research to date, especially after 1908, this building plays a very, very important part in the early history of Fingal, of North County Dublin, of Balrodary Rural District Council, in that period up until the effectively the suspension of Balrodary Rural District Council in 1930. The rural district councils were abolished in 1925 in the rest of the country, but not in Dublin because Dublin wasn't ready. So I looked at a photograph. Now you'll have to bear with me because I have a screen here, but I have a blank screen. So I'm talking from what I know. I'm not actually reading anything. So if I do look across once or twice, forgive me. So I wanted to start off with an old photograph of the Carnegie Library to show what it was like at a previous time. And when I got it, I said, oh my God, that doesn't do justice to what that building looks like, because it is built of red brick and a yellow brick in 1908. And this is it when it has been restored. And you can see exactly what has been done to it. Now, I have some photographs. I'm not an architectural historian, I'm a social historian. So I'm more interested in people than in sills and lintels and plinths and all that kind of stuff. So I'm only going to barely go into some of that. You're sitting now in a room which had played various different parts in the history of Fingal and indeed in the history of Dublin. over the period that the library was here until it closed in 1986. So you can see some of the work that's done. Even if you look up, the trusses are unique. None of the other Carnegie libraries have trusses like this. And this room would have been used for everything from reading rooms within the library to ceilidhs, to meetings, to union meetings, to political meetings. And we're going to look at some of them as we go along. So if we look at the beginning of libraries in Ireland, the first free library was Marsh's Library over beside St. Patrick's Cathedral. And it wasn't until 1850 that the UK Public Libraries Act decided that for boroughs or towns with over 10,000 people, they would allow them to levy a halfpenny on the rates in order to support libraries. But like everything that was done in England during the Victorian period, they didn't necessarily apply it to Ireland that early. A couple of years later, in 1853, they decided to reduce down to 5,000 the population, for which they would allow a levy to be put on the rates. And in 1855, the Public Libraries Act was passed in Ireland. Now, that was adopted very early by some councils, but all they did was adopt it. They said, yeah, we'll adopt that, and then didn't provide any further legislation. So the one that really sticks out is Cork. So Cork were the first to adopt it, but Cork didn't do anything then until 1892, when they actually passed further legislation, bylaws, allowing a rate to be struck. The first public library under this legislation was in Dundalk, and then by 1885, there was only two libraries, one in Dundalk and one in Sligo. There were no libraries in North County Dublin. There weren't even libraries in the city. The first two libraries in the city were the ones in Thomas Street and Capel Street. And actually, before the library in Pearse Street was built, I remember the business library being in Capel Street, and the archival library was in Thomas Street. So if you go up Thomas Street, you'll still see on some of the windows up past, well up past the clock, so heading towards James's Hospital, some of the windows still have Dublin City Libraries, or Dublin Corporation Libraries as it was then. Charlemont Mall, which some of you would be familiar with, was one of the first Carnegie libraries in Dublin. And the three in Dublin were not funded by the library rate, but they were given a grant. And they were given a grant then to buy books as well. In Marsh's Library, when it opened, there was a fear that people would steal books. So they had cages. So you can probably just about see there on the open door, one of the cages. You brought your books in and they locked you in. Now, we might think, oh, that might have been something that happened in the 18th century, but I have had the experience myself of being in the National Library and looking through, particularly Tom's directories, and finding that the page you're looking for has been cut out. And the worst of all was I identified at one stage a beautiful photograph of the original Brackenstown house, only to find that the book I looked at, somebody had cut it out. So that was happening right up until quite recently. Libraries were always underfunded, and the early libraries in Fingal were no different, to anywhere else. They never had enough money. And the big problem with libraries is as you start to run out of books for people to read or for people to take on loan, they just stop going to the libraries. My mother-in-law has recently taken in her retirement to reading, and she has probably got through so many mills and boons that there's certain libraries she won't go to anymore because they don't have enough mills and boons that are still on their catalogue. That happened here, and it's one of the reasons why we do end up with libraries having a shelf life themselves. The other issue that would have happened was, and this was across the board in early independent Ireland, is extreme underfunding. So in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, there was serious problems in terms of replenishing book stocks. The other problem, which was a kind of a perennial problem in Ireland well up to the late 1960s, was censorship. Probably the game changer was the 1947 Libraries Act, passed by Erskine Childers, who was Parliamentary Secretary of the Department of Education at the time, and that started to put more structure on the library system. There was also a couple of organisations. Cumann na Loughran, the Library Association, was quite a short-lived organisation, but it grew up at around the time that the Gaelic, or it was formed at around the time that the Gaelic League was particularly strong in being at the forefront of an independence movement, maybe not legislative independence, but certainly cultural independence in the first decade of the 20th century. And the Carnegie libraries, and this library in particular, play a very, very important role in the development of the Gaelic League. And that rebirth of the language, of culture, of music, of dance, and again of Irish history and Irish identity is very, very important, and both of them go hand in hand. But they would have had in their objectives to promote the Irish language, but also to counter Anglicising forces. You might remember Douglas Hyde's foundation document in 1893 at the birth of the Gaelic League was the case for de-Anglicising Ireland. So there was English customs, there was English newspapers coming in. Like the shock, horror and scandal of the News of the World and the Daily Mirror were not something that happened in the mid-20th century. They were around then. There was also another couple of objectives. One was to reduce drinking. The temperance movement was very strong at this time. If you had people who came here to the library, and particularly to dances or to lectures, it meant they weren't in the pub. So that was one of the things that they were actually trying to stop, and also to prepare boys and girls for emigration, that they needed to be educated. So if we look at the legislation in 1902 that actually gives powers to the RDCs to strike a rate, Balroddery adopted in 1904, and the first committee consisted of 30 people. Now, I often think that committees that have 30 people is the same committee that was asked to design a horse and came up with a camel. So there's always going to be a lot of dissension, a lot of argument. 15 of them were churchmen. So there was 8 parish priests from Fingal area and 7 rectors or vicars from the Church of Ireland, together with Thomas Lester from the National Library, Thomas Kelly from the Old Dublin Society, who was an alderman and sometime mayor of Dublin, and the secretary of the library in Kevin Street. So you had quite a substantial group of men that were on that. The game changer was a man called Andrew Carnegie. Now, Carnegie was born in the 1830s in Dunfermline in Scotland, and he emigrated quite young with his family to Pennsylvania, living near Pittsburgh. He got himself into the steel business, and that's where he made his money. And then he got into the railroad business, and then he got into building carriages for railroads. So he was a man who made a huge fortune. When he retired, he went back to live in a castle in Scotland, and decided then to start giving his money away. In his life, he had seen the power of education. He had seen the difference it made for him, and he decided to fund libraries worldwide. He gave over $57 million to 2,500 libraries to be built. And they were all known as Carnegie Free Libraries. Now, James Bertram was his secretary from 1897, and he's the man who is involved most with Ireland. They built 80 libraries in Ireland between 1897 and 1913. 62 of them are still standing and still being used today. The first was in Newtownards. A lot of them were around Limerick. There's quite a few around Dublin, north and south. You'll have seen them. They're all different designs. They're not a standard design. If you look at libraries like Drumcondra, Inchicore, Ringsend, and Phibsborough, they're all the same design. They all have a very classic Art Deco design from the 1930s. Nearly all of the Carnegie libraries are unique. Even within them, the trusses on the roofs are all quite different, and we'll look at one or two of them. But Bertram was involved heavily with Ireland. There's a newspaper clip of the difference that a library like this had the potential to make to Swords when it was opened. This is Carnegie in 1903 when he came to Waterford for the laying of the foundation stone in the library there. There's other parts of the country that have none at all. There's a handful in Cork. There's actually a few in West Waterford. There's a few in North Kerry and along the Lagan Valley and in Belfast. So the fact that we have the libraries and the number of them in North County Dublin is also a tribute to the people here who applied for the grants from Andrew Carnegie, so that the local politicians here in Balroddery Rural District Council at the time, and slightly before that, as the Board of Guardians, had an interest in libraries as a public service. So if we look in the Carnegie Libraries in Balroddery, they were all under the responsibility of Balroddery Rural District Council, except for Balbriggan. Balbriggan had its own town commissioners, so Balbriggan would have run their own library. So from 1905 to 1912, there were six libraries that were opened, and they never had enough money. Now, P.F. Collier, Peter Fenlon Collier, was a man who had emigrated from Carlow and set up a publishing business eventually in New York, and he donated. When he got older in life, he actually used to come, and one of his friends was the Earl of Fingal. So he used to stay in Killeen Castle. He also had a house that he used to take regularly in Athlumney, up near Navan. And he would donate 300 or 400 books to each library that opened from his publishing company in New York. So you had benefactors like that actually helped. So here's a couple of examples of some of the other libraries. Now, you walked in here today. North Street in 1908 was like a track. They didn't have a road. They had a few cottages. There was very, very little. So a building like this was a statement building. It was a significant public building. If you look at the library in Skerries, which is the one on the top left, you can see it's almost like a church, how it's built. But I think it's important to see what it looked like in the street. Down on the bottom left, to see how imposing it was. Again, standing, the one on the right is Malahide in the earlier years of the 20th century. And even though there's a lot of stuff built around it now, Malahide is very, very imposing and significant as a public building. And actually, it took a while to get a site, because they had asked Lord Talbot of Malahide on numerous occasions would he provide a site, and he refused. So it took them a few years, so that was a little bit later. So Anthony Scott was the architect here. He also worked for Balroddery District Council as an engineer and architect. The builders were Bissett and Macready, cost £912, and there was an overrun. And I managed to find out what caused the overrun. The overrun was the railings at the front. So there was railings put in, and they weren't in the original estimates. So there was the same scrutiny in 1908, 1907 when it was built, 1908 when it opened, as you would have today. On the original committee were Colonel James Fitzeustace Foster, who was an old Catholic Unionist, and his house was where Fingal County Council offices are now. The trees that are at the front are the same trees that were at the front of his garden. So if you walk under those trees and you get bird droppings on you, they're probably descendants of the same birds that were there well over 100 years ago. Mr. Hamill from the Newborough School was also on the original committee. There was a Mr. Cobb. Now, it's not Charles Cobb because he was deceased. It's not Henry. I couldn't find out yet which Mr. Cobb it is, but he was one of them, as was Nicholas Long, who was a rural district councillor who lived at Milton House. So Anthony Scott mainly built churches, and he also built labourers' cottages. So the 1883 and 1884 Labourers Acts was the first time that there was any kind of council housing inaugurated in Ireland. He built an awful lot of them. He designed an awful lot of them and was involved in building them. They are so good that you still see them around today. So if anybody's familiar with the 12 Apostles, which is out the Rathby Road. They are some of them. And you'll see them dotted all around the place. There's some in Coolock. They're certainly dotted all around the North County as well. So there was about 35,000 that was spent in that decade on labourers' cottages. So he would have been heavily involved in that. He was on a salary of 100 a year. He was also himself a councillor in Pembroke, which is the Dublin 4 area. And he was also involved in other building organisations. Now, as I said, I'm not an architect. It's not an architectural history. But this is some of the detail that you would have had. And particularly the things that stand out is the mixture of bricks between the red and the yellow. Also the wooden truss that's here in the roof, which again is fantastic. And if you think of this, not alone, but now, I use the National Library a lot. And sometimes I go into the National Library and I just sit there for 5 minutes and say how blessed I am to be able to work in a place like this. If you ever get the chance to go into the National Library, you do need a ticket to use the books, but they will let you go up and have a look upstairs. There's also a fantastic Lego model of the library downstairs in the reception. So you're looking at some of the details that are there in terms of what we have, in terms of the windows, the number of windows that were there, and the fittings. So this is the general reading room upstairs. Downstairs, when you came in, the original door would have been where the librarian's office is. And I'm just going to show you that. We also had a ladies' room. So at this time, it would have been deemed appropriate that ladies would have their own reading room. And there would have been a second reading room. Now, the second reading room, at one stage, there was an underuse by ladies, and they had a smoking room. So you weren't allowed to smoke in the library, but they did have a smoking room, and they also had a newspaper reading room. Now, the newspaper reading room had its own particular problems and challenges, and I'll explain what they are now in a moment. So this is one of the newspaper reading rooms. And one of the issues that was there with some of the committees, and particularly with the clergymen that were on the committees from the early stages, was, is the library for serious readers? And should it only be used for lectures and educational purposes? Or is it free and available to everybody? Because you would get idlers in. You would get people who would, if anybody's ever been in the Central Library, in the ILAC Centre, they'll know what I'm talking about. You get people in for the day. What have you got at either end of this room? 1, 2. What have you got downstairs? 1, 2. Fireplaces. So that means the place is warm. Now, when we look at this particular room with the newspapers, and the newspapers would have been up on reading plinths, there was a particular problem with certain pages in the newspapers. Anybody know what those pages were? For backing the horses. Thanks, Larry. For racing. At one stage, they actually cut out the racing pages. But there was different pages that came in, and once a week, certain English newspapers came in. And the punters knew that there was also racing cards and racing results in them. And you could get the newspapers monopolised by the same guy coming in every morning and looking for race cards. And one of the big racetracks that wasn't that far from here was Bellewstown and Baldoyle. So you had two race courses that were this is quite apart from Point to Point, were two significant race courses in the area. So that was always deemed to be an issue. Within the rules and regulations, you had you couldn't drink, you couldn't smoke, you couldn't touch any of the plates in the book. So any of the illustrations would have been on a photographic type paper, and if you were caught running your finger up and down them, you were kicked out. But there's also an interesting one there. People who looked scruffy or untidy could be removed by the librarian. So this is just prior to the registration. So you had the two former reading rooms downstairs. One of them was used by Swords Boxing Club at one stage. These are quite detailed from Fitzgerald and Kavanagh. And again, you can see that this area up here, this end was a genealogy office, the other end was a local museum. I'll talk about that a little bit later on. But just to give you an idea, this is where the stairs where you would have come up. This is the original librarian's hatch. So the librarians would have had, there was actually two hatches, one in the middle and one to the left, and the librarians would have been behind that. And at different times, they employed, particularly in 1920, there was an issue with the first librarian and the second librarian. There was 2 female and 2 male candidates. And even though Miss O'Gorman was one of the interviewing panel, she favoured a male librarian, because a male librarian had a better chance of being able to remove unruly elements that might have come into the library, especially if they were from the racing fraternity or people that were doing stuff like that. So this is what it looks like now since it has been restored. And again, the full restoration brings back, in some sense, a feeling of what this place was like. So the big issues in terms of the connection here with Irish independence happened via the Gaelic League. In 1905, Balrodry Rural District Council, and this was when the first library was opened in Balbriggan, passed a resolution that all librarians going forward should have some command of the Irish language. The president of Swords Gaelic League was Frank Lawless. Frank Lawless was very important in terms of his role in the independence movement in North County Dublin. He was a member of Sinn Féin from 1906 with Arthur Griffith. He was the president of Sinn Féin in the North County. He was also a member of the IRB. He was an IRB leader in terms of some of the Dublin circles from 1908, because I've researched him independently. He was also the spokesman for Sinn Féin in 1911 on agriculture with Countess Markovich was involved at that stage, Hannah Sheehy Skeffington was involved at that stage, as was Arthur Griffith and Sean T. O'Kelly. So you're looking at somebody who is significant. He's also chairman of Fingalian's GAA club, and he's involved across all of the networks within them. He was also a member of the Keating's GAA club, hurling club, with Cathal Brugha. So his connections were very, very significant, and he pushed the Gaelic League and the Irish language in the North County area. Now, from a very early stage, the Gaelic League applied to have meetings here, and they were turned down by the committee. And one of the most influential members of the committee was Father David Mulcahy, who was the parish priest of Swords, and he was a significant Home Rule supporter. Now, the Home Rule party at the time had a number of bishops: the Bishop of Cork, the Bishop of Down and Connor, Patrick O'Donnell, the Bishop of Raphoe, were very senior trustees of the Irish Parliamentary Party stroke Home Rule Party. In fact, O'Donnell was the treasurer. So you had a lot of clerical involvement, which was anti-Gaelic League, was anti what was the beginnings of advanced nationalism. So that division in North County Dublin plays out quite a bit over that time. And it's interesting that the Reverend Percy Whelan, who was the rector of the Church of Ireland in Swords, actually wrote to the newspapers, wrote to the Drogheda Independent, and came out in support of the Gaelic League as a non-sectarian organisation that was looking at the language and Irish history. Now, Gaelic League classes became very popular in this part of the world, as it did in Dublin City. It was probably more powerful here and more successful here than anywhere else, because it had a number of things going for it. One was, if you had meetings in somewhere like this, it was warm because you did have the fires, so people would come for that reason. The other thing is that sometimes they would have ceilidhs. And what do you do in a ceilidh? What can you do in a ceilidh in 1910 that you can't do anywhere else? You can hold hands with girls. And it's seen as wholesome because it's Irish. It's within the Irish language. So you had a lot of very, very mixed Gaelic League coming. Now, They may not have been all Irish language. Some of it could have been, this is where you meet girls, this is where you meet women, this is where you can go dancing. But it helped to promote it. It was largely a spoken language because there wasn't money for books, there wasn't money for copies, so they would have learned to talk. If you're promoting the Irish language, what do you talk about? You talk about Ireland, you talk about the saints, you talk about Cromwell, you talk about Onro O'Sullivan, you talk about O'Neill and O'Donnell. And they were inculcating an independence identity within people that were going there. And that would have been part of the reason as well that you had some of the clerics were against it. So in 1909, there was a motion that was defeated. And Father Mulcahy always wanted to be at every meeting to make a decision. And what is one of the things that is an advantage for a parish priest being head of each individual library subcommittee? They can decide what books are bought. They can veto what might be in the library. So there was an application to use the ladies' reading room because it wasn't being used, and he objected to it. And he's actually quoted as saying, the leaders of the Gaelic League in Swords are also the leaders of Sinn Féin. And he was referring specifically to Frank Lawless. By the way, Frank Lawless and his family would have rotated a lot of the positions in Fingalian's GAA club as well. And if you found that he was president of the Gaelic League, his daughter was the secretary, and his wife had another role. So you have a political dynasty effectively there. In 1911, there was a number of complaints of promiscuous dancing taking place within here. Now, whether that was promiscuous Irish dancing or not, I don't know. I wasn't able to find out. But that was in the library minutes from 1911. But this is the one where the big kind of row took place. And it was between the Swords Library Committee and the Gaelic League. Now, the chairman of Balroddery Rural District at the council at the time was Richard Rooney from Winestown, out near the Knoll. And he was married to Julia Lawless. Wouldn't that make sense? Who was Frank's sister. So he was of the same political persuasion as Frank Lawless. But they had applied to have a dance here. And a dance and a concert, and they got permission, and the concert was to take place at the end of October in 1911, and 2 days before it was due to take place, Father Mulcahy came back from a holiday in the United States, and he said this was done without my permission, and they were charging for tickets, so he cancelled, and he said the arrangement is cancelled. It's a free library, and if it's not free, they're not going to run it. Nobody's going to make money out of it. So the whole thing ended up being cancelled, but as you can imagine, there was a row. They had printed posters, they had sold tickets. Francis Coleman, who was related to Richard Coleman, who died in 1918 and was involved in the 1916 Rising, and was a teacher. He was the secretary of the Gaelic League at the time, and they stood to lose a lot of money, and they complained. And at the next Rural District Council meeting, which took place out in the workhouse in Lusk, at Balloch, Balroddery Workhouse, Father Mulcahy stormed into the meeting and demanded to be heard. And they voted, yes, he can be heard. But Richard Rooney, who was in the chair, said that's outside of the procedures. You can't just walk in to a council meeting like that and demand to be heard. So words were exchanged at that particular time, and a row developed. He said, I wasn't here, I didn't pass that. So that kind of atmosphere prevailed then for quite an amount of time, and there were letters to the newspapers from Mulcahy's side and from Richard Rooney's side, and there was never really a coming together. In the period 1914-1915, after Cumann na Món was formed, Cumann na Món applied to run first aid classes here in the building, most likely in this room or the small room downstairs. And Father Mulcahy, plus his successors, other priests, actually said they can hold the classes, but they're not allowed to use the library's coal. So any way they could get in to try and put obstacles in their way, this kind of animus continued for a period. Now, there were those who were supporters of Father Mulcahy, and when he died, they passed a number of motions saying what a great man he was and what he had done. And this is the Irish history, the local history. He did a huge amount for the library, but at the same time, he followed his path, and he would have criticised other people who didn't agree with him. And you'll find that with most of the personalities that you come across in the history of North County Dublin. Now, this showed here in this room on the 9th of May 1920, and it is the film Knocknagow, based on the book by C.J. Kickham, around the time of the famine. And I had a copy of it, so I was actually going to give you the experience of looking at something that was actually played in here. But we had a block earlier. I'm going to see if I can get it at the end. I think I might have been able to find it. So instead of wasting any time trying to set it up here, we'll carry on. That ran here in 1920. Again, because of what we saw happening in 1911, this rolls on into the 1920. Who actually controls? And the Drogheda Independent gave a very, very clear indication of who runs or who controls the Carnegie Library and Swords in 1920, which was during the height of the War of Independence. A Sinn Féin flag was seen flying over the library. Again, in the 1920s, there were other references to bans on promiscuous dancing, but that was probably more likely to be jazz in that later stage. In 1920, there was a case that was brought before the Library Committee of the misappropriation of funds by the librarian. So a donation of £10 was made, and it wasn't properly accounted for, and the librarian was brought before the committee and was suspended and then was dismissed. And when they went to get a second librarian, this is when they made a decision: we'll get a man, because we don't know what kind of roughs we're going to get at different times. I might actually go back, because I had slightly lost track because of the technicals. When it said about the row in 1911 over the roughs, Father Mulcahy said everything has to be free. And Richard Rooney actually made a comment, well, you'll have every rough and tough and idler in Swords if it's free, trying to get in to a concert. And Father Mulcahy said, well, they're all people of the flock. So you had all of this kind of comment and counter comment going on. It's interesting that at the bottom of these minutes, there was actually an application by the Pavilion Cinema in Ballybock to book out this room for a week at that particular time. But they decided, again, look at the date. The date is September 1920. They decided we'd postpone it because of what was happening in Brixton Prison at the time, the imminent death on hunger strike of Tomás McSweeney. So this is where you see what's happening on a daily basis in the library, connected to what's happening in Ireland. In the 1930s, there was actually domestic science classes that were held here. So an awful lot of the Carnegie Library started to be used as additional vocational educational committee premises. And there would have been a VEC college just beside us here. So it would have made sense that took place. There was various different meetings would have taken place at different times. In the 1950s, following the kind of the mini boom of the building of the airport, there was unemployment problems again post-war, and there was a number of meetings that were held here. Eamon Rooney, who would have been the Cumann Gael TD for County Dublin or North County at the time, he held a number of meetings here on those grounds. There was work when the airport was being built, but I've read through a lot of the material from that time, and as soon as the ground clearance was finished, there was a case of a question that was raised in the Dáil over the number of Cork and Kerry accents that were being heard when the proper building started to take place, all the Fingal men were more or less let go. I then looked to see what was happening in the library. So we all know what libraries do. You can go in, you can read books, you can loan books. But this became very much the heart of Swords. It became almost a community centre. And I looked through some of the organisations that would have been here. Swords Silver Circle, Swords Choral Society, the National Farmers Association, Swords Young Farmers, Swords Angling Club, Fingal Old IRA, the Irish Countrymen's Association, Swords Baby Club used to meet here. And that was for inoculations and vaccinations. That was to try and get people to bring children, and they would have tea or they'd have sandwiches or whatever, and to bring in, meet other mothers, but also to encourage them to get BCGs, to get inoculations against polio, that type of thing. The Civil Defence met weekly. All of the common, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and Labour met here. Swords Town Development met on a regular basis. The Fingal League, GAA, would have met here almost every week. For the best part of 40 or 50 years. I'm actually old enough to remember when the Fingal League used to have a team in the Dublin Senior Championship, and they were quite good. Now, football, Gaelic football in North County Dublin is good enough to put in their own teams. By 1969, Swords Gun Club, and reflecting what's happening with the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland and demands here, a number of tenants associations start to meet on a regular basis. The Domain, Commons East, Seatown, Glassmore, Rathbeal. So you see a reflection of what is happening in society at that time. Again, some of these, again, the old IRA, the Red Cross, Swords Fesh, Fingalians, you're seeing it being used and people that are in and out at a significant level. Ceoltas Ceoltóirí Éireann, Wavin Pipes Workers Group, Swords Boy Scouts, the Pioneers. So almost every organisation that I see that was ever set up in Swords would have had meetings here and probably in this room at some stage. Now, by the mid-1980s, the building was old, the building was in a degree of disrepair, and Rathbeal Library was set up. And when Rathbeal Library opened in 1984, the lending here declined from 50 books a week to 5 books a week. At the same time, Rathbeal was lending out an average of 4,600 odd books, and they decided that they would close the library here. Now, the building was still being used at the time by the district court next door, so they would have had offices here. It wasn't used as a court as far as I know, but it was used by the district court clerical service. So there was a statutory right to continue to supply it. It was then transferred to Community Affairs in Dublin County Council, and they made a decision then to close. Now, Swords Historical Society applied to use the premises here. With any premises that's being used by a third party, there's always a liability that ends up with the owners being the council at the time. So that would have been an issue, but they did see themselves fit to allow a tenancy. So Swords Museum opened here in 1987, and you can see there some of the other projects the Swords Historical Society run since that period by Bernadette Marks were involved in. I was actually able to find, and when you look at how great and beautiful this building is, and the part it played in the community, and the part it played, let's say, in the independence movement, this is the actual sign that went up on the door when it closed. It's actually in the files. And it's just a small, handwritten, the part-time library will cease to operate from the 26th of March, 1986. It's just written in a marker. It's quite a sad end to something that we would have had like that. So, thank you very much.